At 11:14 a.m. on May 10, 1945, First Lieutenant Robert Klingman reached 38,000 FT above Okinawa, relentlessly pursuing a Japanese NIC reconnaissance plane. The 28-year-old pilot had flown 43 combat sorties since 6 weeks earlier when he arrived at Kadena Airfield. His F4U Corsair was 3,000 FT above its service ceiling, where the atmosphere was thin enough to be fatal. The Japanese Kawasaki Ki-45 NIC was a high-altitude twin-engine heavy fighter, capable of cruising at 35,000 FT, capturing photographs of the American fleet's locations for the terrifying kamikaze strikes that had already sunk 12 vessels in the preceding week. Every successful surveillance flight promised another wave of suicide attacks. Every photo meant more American sailors burning in oil-slicked waters. The NIC reconnaissance planes habitually completed 2 full passes over the fleet before withdrawing homeward. They flew too high for any feasible interception, too high for anti-aircraft artillery. They were untouchable. Marine Fighter Squadron 312 had lost 4 flyers to kamikaze attacks in April. The Japanese launched an estimated 1,400 kamikaze sorties during the Battle of Okinawa. 26 American ships were sent to the bottom. 368 more sustained damage. These vital reconnaissance flights made that destruction possible. The NICs would photograph fleet positions, quickly relay the coordinates to strike coordinators, and then vanish into Japanese-held airspace before American fighter craft could climb high enough to engage. Klingman and 3 other Corsair pilots had taken off from Kadena at 9:40 a.m. for their combat air patrol. Captain Kenneth Rouser was leading the flight. At 10:37, radar operators detected an unidentified aircraft approaching from the north at 25,000 FT. It was the NIC. Rouser immediately ordered the flight to climb. He instructed them to jettison their belly tanks containing reserve fuel. He then ordered them to fire off ammunition to decrease the aircraft's weight. Klingman fired 2,000 rounds into the empty Pacific Ocean. 687 pounds of weight vanished in 30 seconds. The lightened Corsair accelerated its climb, but it was not fast enough. At 20,000 FT, 2 pilots reported mechanical difficulties in the thin air. Captain Jim Cox and Second Lieutenant Frank Watson both reported their engines running roughly. Rouser ordered them to return to the designated patrol altitude over the fleet. The NIC completed its second observation pass. It banked north, heading for home. Rouser and Klingman pushed their engines to maximum emergency power. The NIC began to pull away. Both pilots pushed their F4Us far beyond their operational design limits. Cylinder head temperatures rapidly reached the red line indicator and continued to rise. The engines faced potential failure at any moment. At 36,000 FT, the Corsair's official rated service ceiling, both aircraft continued their ascent. 37,000, 38,000, 3,000 FT, beyond what chance vote engineers had ever guaranteed. The air was now as thin as that on high mountaintops. Control surfaces became sluggish in their response. Any sudden, sharp turn would instantly stall the aircraft. A stall at 38,000 FT guaranteed an uncontrollable spin. No hope of recovery, no chance for a bailout, only death. The 2 Corsairs closed the gap very slowly. Rouser achieved firing range first. He emptied his remaining magazine at the NIC. Bullets ripped through the Japanese plane's right engine. Flames erupted from the cowling. The NIC decreased speed, but continued flying on its single working engine. Rouser's guns were now empty. He pulled aside. Klingman maneuvered to line up his own shot, positioning himself 50 FT directly behind the NIC. The Japanese rear gunner swiftly swiveled his Type 98 machine gun toward the approaching Corsair. Bullets punched through Klingman's right wing. He dismissed the damage. He pressed the trigger switch. Nothing happened. The guns had frozen solid at 38,000 FT. The extreme frigid cold had locked the firing mechanisms tight. 2,000 rounds already jettisoned to reduce weight. What little remained was now useless frozen metal. The NIC accelerated away once more, still trailing smoke from its damaged motor. But it was still airborne, still perfectly capable of transmitting the vital reconnaissance data to Japanese commanders, and still capable of guiding tomorrow's devastating kamikaze attacks against American destroyers and carriers. Klingman had climbed for 90 minutes. He He had pushed his aircraft 3,000 FT past its design limitations. He had only one desperate chance before the Nick completely escaped. Could Klingman stop this crucial reconnaissance flight? Before you hear the insane solution, please take a moment. Hit the like button to help more viewers discover this incredible act of courage. Share this video with a friend, and subscribe to our channel for more forgotten stories of World War II history. Back to 38,000 FT. He made his critical decision in mere seconds. He advanced the throttle to maximum power. He climbed to a position above the Nick. He radioed his plan to Rouser, delivering only 3 stark words. He would ram the Japanese aircraft using his 4-bladed propeller. At 38,000 FT, 3,000 FT above his aircraft's operational ceiling, where the air could barely sustain flight, he would employ his Corsair as a ballistic weapon. The 4-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller, spinning violently at 2,000 revolutions per minute, became his only available gun. He nosed down directly toward the Nick's tail section. The Japanese rear gunner fired frantically. Bullets tore through the Corsair's right-wing fabric skin. Klingman held his dive angle steady. 20ft, 15ft, 10ft. The propeller blades closed the distance instantly. The Nick's tail section entirely filled his windscreen. Metal made contact with metal at a closing speed of over 300 MAF. The propeller blades chewed into the aluminum rudder. Fragments of metal flew past the cockpit canopy. The Nick shuddered violently, but miraculously kept flying. Klingman pulled up, shaking, for a second assault. His Corsair vibrated severely. The damaged propeller created a terrible, severe imbalance throughout the entire airframe. The cylinder head temperature gauge climbed even higher into the red zone. He knew he had minutes, perhaps seconds, before a catastrophic engine failure. The Nick's gunner now turned his weapon toward Rouser, who was flying protectively alongside. Klingman plunged again into the prop wash. This time, his propeller tore through the rear cockpit canopy. The machine gun mount was completely sheared off. The gunner and his weapon disappeared instantly into the slipstream at 300 mph. Still, the Nick flew level on its one remaining engine. Klingman now had 2 deeply bent propeller blades. His engine was fatally overheating. He climbed, determined for a third final attack. Klingman's third dive came from a position directly above. He pushed the control stick forward aggressively. The Corsair nosed over directly into the Nick's tail section. The damaged propeller struck forcefully at the very base of the vertical stabilizer. Metal shrieked hideously. The entire tail assembly separated from the fuselage. The Nick immediately pitched forward into an uncontrolled, lethal dive. Pieces of the aircraft tumbled through the sky. The fuselage spun as it plummeted toward the Pacific Ocean, 15,000 FT below. No parachutes appeared. The crew went down with their reconnaissance photographs. The kamikaze coordinators would receive no intelligence from this mission. Klingman's Corsair immediately began to shake with catastrophic violence. The third impact had bent 2 propeller blades almost back to the engine cowling. 6 inches of the third blade had been sheared off completely. The resulting unbalanced propeller created a deadly vibration. The control stick bucked and vibrated in his hands. Metal groaned audibly throughout the airframe. He could barely read his instruments. He cut the power immediately to idle. The vibration decreased slightly. He carefully worked the rudder pedals. At 36,000 FT, any sudden or large input would worsen his deadly situation. He applied opposite rudder slowly. The Corsair stabilized in a slow turn. The nose came up tentatively. Level flight returned, but the aircraft handled like it had experienced critical structural damage. The cylinder head temperature gauge showed maximum red. The oil pressure indicator was rapidly dropping. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine had operated at maximum emergency power for nearly 2 hours at altitudes where it was never engineered to function. Every internal component was stressed far beyond specifications. Engine failure was absolutely imminent. Klingman turned south toward Kadena Airfield, 70 miles away. He further reduced power to prevent a complete seizure. The Corsair descended slowly through the thin upper air. Rouser formed up on his wingtip. Neither pilot needed to speak on the radio. Both understood the gravity of the situation. The damaged Corsair might not survive the flight back home. At 20,000 FT, the fuel gauge showed nearly empty. Klingman had consumed fuel at a maximum rate during the 90-minute pursuit climb. He calculated his remaining fuel, maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. The distance to Kadena required 15 minutes at his current power setting and descent rate. There was no margin for error. Black smoke began trailing from the engine cowling. It wasn't fire, but the thin smoke of burning oil. A critical seal had failed inside the engine block. Oil was leaking onto hot metal. Without lubrication, the engine would seize completely. The propeller would stop. A dead stick landing with a propeller that could barely turn was all that remained. At 10,000 FT, Klingman saw Okinawa ahead. Kadena sat on the western coast. The main runway stretched 3,600 FT, long enough for normal arrivals, but not nearly long enough for an emergency dead stick landing without engine power, especially with a damaged, drag-creating propeller. He would have a single attempt. Rouser radioed the tower. He reported Klingman's dire emergency. Crash crews immediately rolled toward the runway, fire trucks and ambulances. They positioned themselves along the final approach path. Damaged, unbalanced propellers could tear entire engines from their mounts upon landing impact. The engine could cartwheel through the cockpit. Several pilots had died that way. At 5,000 FTC, the engine coughed once. The fuel gauge touched empty. Klingman switched to the reserve tank. Nothing. He had burned the reserves during the climb. The engine coughed a second time. Black smoke poured violently from the cowling. The propeller began windmilling as power dropped away. 3 miles from the runway, he carefully adjusted his glide path. The destroyed propeller created drag he could not accurately predict. The aircraft handled unlike any emergency he had ever trained for. He lowered the landing gear manually. The hydraulic system had just enough residual pressure for one extension attempt. The wheels locked down with confirming green lights. At the 1,000 FT, the engine completely quit. The propeller stopped turning. Complete silence returned, except for the rushing wind over the wings. Klingman trimmed for best glide speed, 85 knots. He aimed for the runway threshold. He planned to land and apply maximum braking immediately. The only alternative was the rough terrain short of the runway. At 500 FT, he realized he was slightly too high. The Corsair would float past the threshold. He deliberately slipped the aircraft sideways to rapidly lose altitude. The damaged propeller caught the wind wrong. The nose yawed violently. He corrected with the rudder. 200 FT, 100 FT. The threshold passed beneath. The main wheels touched down 800 FT past the threshold. 2,800 feet of runway remained. Klingman stood hard on the brakes. The Corsair slowed, but the locked, destroyed propeller created zero drag. Normal propellers windmilled and aided deceleration. His was entirely useless. 1,800 Faidu, 1,400, 1,000. The aircraft rolled toward the far end at 40 knots. Crash crews raced alongside, desperately. Klingman pumped the brakes hard. The tires smoked against the concrete. 30 knots, 20 knots. The runway end approached rapidly. 600 FT, 400, 200. The Corsair came to a stop with 300 FT of runway remaining. He shut down all remaining systems. His hands were shaking. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft. They stared at the propeller, 2 blades bent back toward the cowling, 6 inches entirely missing from the third, bullet holes visible in the wing, and thick oil covering the entire engine. The Corsair looked utterly destroyed. Maintenance crews inspected the damage. They declared the aircraft beyond repair. The engine was destroyed. The propeller was unusable. Stress damage was noted throughout the airframe. They would strip it for components and scrap the remaining frame. Klingman had killed an enemy reconnaissance plane and simultaneously destroyed his own F4U Corsair. Intelligence officers immediately debriefed him. Navy regulations mandated pilot statements within hours of combat. Klingman described every detail: the frozen guns at altitude, the desperate decision to ram, the 3 propeller attacks, the Nix tail separating, the fatal plunge without parachutes, the entire engagement at 38,000 FTSE stars. They confirmed the kill. Rouser had witnessed the entire action. The Nick went down with its crew and all its reconnaissance data. No kamikaze strikes would ever use those photographs. No American ships would burn from that crucial intelligence. The mission succeeded despite impossible circumstances. 2 days later, Klingman experienced hydraulic failure on another mission. He was forced to bail out over the ocean. A destroyer recovered him after 30 minutes in the water. He returned to Kadena and was flying again the very next day. But what he accomplished on May 10th would define his entire wartime service. At 38,000 FT with frozen guns and zero alternatives, he had turned his own aircraft into a weapon. Robert Klingman was born on January 12, 1917, in Binger, Oklahoma, one of 9 children. The Great Depression severely impacted his family. His parents sent him to Fort Sill for civilian military training during the summer of 1934. The government provided food and clothing for the participants for 30 days, a form of free relief for struggling families. Klingman learned military discipline and realized he wanted more. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in August 1934 at age 17. Basic training followed at Parris Island. He was assigned to Marine Barracks, Washington, D.C. as a drummer in the ceremonial unit. 4 years of service, during which he sent paychecks home to his mother in Oklahoma. He was discharged in 1938. He returned home and opened a small burger cafe. The business barely survived the tough times. His brother encouraged him to join the Navy in 1940, citing better pay and better opportunities. Klingman enlisted and reported to the USS Tennessee as an aircraft maintenance mechanic. He advanced to first class quickly. His timing was terrible. December 7th, 1941. Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The USS Tennessee took 2 direct bomb hits. Klingman was ashore at San Diego, completing carrier training when his ship was burning. He finished carrier operations training in September 1942. The Navy discharged him to the inactive reserve and then selected him for aviation cadet training. He was 25 years old. Most cadets were 19 or 20. He worked harder than the younger men to keep pace. He finished in the top 10% of his pre-flight class. Flight school was at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. Graduation and commission as a Marine second lieutenant. Orders to Marine Fighter Squadron 312 at Parris Island. Training on the F4U Corsair. The aircraft was novel for carrier operations. The Navy generally preferred the easier F6F Hellcat. The Marines received the Corsairs for land-based operations. VMF 312 trained for 6 months. They deployed to the Pacific in March 1945. The squadron arrived at Kadena Airfield in early April. American forces had secured the field during the initial Okinawa invasion. Japanese resistance continued fiercely across the island. The battle would last 82 days, the longest and bloodiest Pacific campaign, resulting in 12,000 American deaths, 77,000 Japanese deaths, and 150,000 Okinawan civilian deaths. The kamikazes were a far worse threat to the Navy than the ground combat was. Japanese pilots flew heavily loaded aircraft directly into American ships. Conventional attacks could often be evaded. Kamikazes only needed to hit once. A 500 lb bomb on a Zero fighter became a guided missile. American destroyers and carriers burned from single impacts. The Japanese named the tactic Tokotai, Special Attack Units. American sailors simply called them kamikazes, Divine Wind. Between April 1st and June 22nd, Japan launched 1,900 individual kamikaze sorties against American ships off Okinawa. They sank 36 ships. They damaged 368 more. 5,000 American sailors died. 4,600 were wounded. The reconnaissance flights made the kamikazes possible. Japanese Nick aircraft flew consistently above American fighter altitude. They photographed fleet positions twice daily, morning and afternoon passes. The photographs were rushed to Tokotai coordinators who assigned specific targets to specific pilots. Destroyer DD-724 at these coordinates. Carrier CV-16 at those coordinates. The kamikazes launched with precise navigation data. American fighters were failing to stop these reconnaissance flights. F6F Hellcats had service ceilings of 38,000 FT, but could not maintain combat capability that high. F4U Corsairs were rated to 36,000 FT. Both aircraft struggled just to climb to interception altitude before the Knicks completed their photographic passes and departed. The Japanese were flying with almost total impunity. VMF 312 lost 4 pilots to kamikazes in April, not from direct hits. The squadron operated from Kadena, but kamikaze attacks constantly disrupted operations. Japanese aircraft repeatedly attacked the airfield. American fighters scrambled to intercept the threat. Some pilots never came back. The kamikazes were killing Americans both on land and at sea. Klingman flew his very first combat mission on April 8th. Combat air patrol over the fleet. No contact with the enemy. His second mission, April 10th, involved intercepting a kamikaze attack. He shot down 1-0. His third mission, April 14th, was ground support for Marines fighting in southern Okinawa. He fired rockets at Japanese positions. These were standard missions, nothing unusual. By May 10th, he had flown 43 combat missions in 32 days, one mission per day on average, sometimes 2 daily sorties. When the tempo increased, he had 3 confirmed kills, 2 zeros, and 1 reconnaissance aircraft that happened to fly too low. These were standard targets, nothing like what he would face that morning. The mission briefing at 08:30 was routine, 4-ship combat air patrol, altitude 13,000 FT station, 10 miles north of Kadena. Standard intercept position. Captain Rouser would lead the flight. Klingman was his wingman. 2 additional Corsairs for backup. They expected a normal patrol, maybe intercept a kamikaze, maybe return without any contact. Nobody mentioned the high-altitude Nick problem. The radar operators detected the bogey at 10:37, altitude 25,000 FT heading south, speed 220 knots. A Nick on reconnaissance. Rouser made his decision immediately. They would intercept. They would climb beyond their normal altitude limitations. They would stop this reconnaissance flight. The next kamikaze wave absolutely depended on it. What happened when 4 Corsairs pushed beyond their design limits to catch 1 Nick? Would the extreme altitude kill them before they even reached the enemy? At 38,000 FT, where engines failed and controls froze, could American pilots possibly stop Japanese reconnaissance? The answer would determine how many ships burned tomorrow. Rouser ordered an immediate rapid climb. All 4 Corsairs pushed throttles forward and pulled up aggressively from 13,000 FT. The F4U was designed for this kind of climb. Maximum power, full throttle. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines roared. 18 cylinders per engine, 2,000 horsepower each. The Corsairs climbed at 4,000 FT per minute initially. At 15,000 FT, Rouser ordered them to drop their external fuel tanks. The belly tanks held fuel for extended range missions. They also created unnecessary drag. All 8 pilots reached for the tank release handles. 4 tanks fell away and tumbled toward the ocean. The Corsairs immediately climbed faster without the weight and drag. 18,000 FT, Rouser gave the next directive. Fire off ammunition to reduce weight. Klingman pressed his trigger. 6 Browning M2 machine guns fired simultaneously, 3 in each wing. 50 caliber rounds at 800 rounds per minute per gun. He held the trigger down for 40 seconds. 2,000 rounds disappeared into the empty ocean. 687 LBs were gone. The other 3 pilots followed suit. 12,000 rounds fired into the Pacific in 2 minutes. The ammunition was insurance against enemy fighters, but the Nick was not a fighter. It was a reconnaissance aircraft, only lightly armed. The Americans needed altitude more critically than ammunition. They urgently needed to catch the Nick before it completed its mission and escaped. At 20,000 FT, the air began to grow noticeably thin. The engines had to work harder to maintain power. Superchargers compressed the thin air before forcing it into the cylinders. The system was designed for this altitude, but it consumed more fuel than usual. The Corsairs had already dropped their reserve tanks. They were operating on internal fuel only. Maybe 90 minutes of flight time remained at this power setting. Captain Jim Cox reported engine trouble. His Corsair was running roughly. Cylinder head temperature was climbing and oil pressure was fluctuating. The extreme altitude was stressing his engine beyond normal operating limits. Second Lieutenant Frank Watson reported similar severe problems moments later. Both pilots were at 22,000 FT, still 8,000 FT below the Nick. Rouser made the decisive call. He ordered Cox and Watson back down to normal patrol altitude over the fleet. 2 Corsairs would continue the pursuit, Rouser and Klingman. The Nick was completing its second surveillance pass over American ships. It turned north for home. The window of opportunity was closing fast. They had mere minutes to intercept, or the reconnaissance data would reach Japanese commanders. Rouser and Klingman advanced to maximum emergency power, a setting beyond normal maximum. The throttles had a safety wire that prevented advancement past the normal maximum thrust. Both pilots broke the wire and shoved the throttles past the stop. Emergency war power. The engines could sustain this for maybe 5 minutes before certain damage occurred. Perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less. They would need far more than 10 minutes. The cylinder head temperature gauges climbed alarmingly into the red zones. The oil temperature gauges followed them. Every bearing in both engines was operating beyond design specifications. Every piston was cycling faster than Pratt & Whitney engineers had ever intended. The superchargers screamed as they compressed the increasingly thin air. The engines faced failure at any moment. At 25,000 FT, they spotted the Nick, a dark speck against the intense blue sky, 4 miles ahead, still climbing. The Nick crew had successfully spotted the pursuing Corsairs. They were running for Japanese airspace at maximum speed. The Kawasaki Ki 45 had 2 Mitsubishi Hei 102 engines, 1,080 horsepower each, less powerful than the Corsairs. But the Nick was purpose-designed for high altitude. Its service ceiling was a comfortable 32,800 FT. The Corsairs were theoretically rated to 36,000 FT, but that was academic. In practice, the Corsair struggled severely above 30,000 FT. At 30,000 FT, both pilots felt the controls go soft. The air was too thin to provide normal aerodynamic force. The control surfaces responded sluggishly. A sharp or sudden turn would stall the aircraft immediately. A stall would result in an uncontrollable spin. Recovery would be impossible. They had to maintain incredibly smooth control inputs. No sudden movements, no panic whatsoever. The Nick climbed steadily to 35,000 FT. Rouser and Klingman followed. Their engines were now past the 10-minute mark on emergency war power. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The cylinder head temperature remained buried deep in the red. The oil pressure gauges fluctuated erratically. Something was going to break. It was a question of when, not if. At 36,000 FT, they reached the Corsair's rated service ceiling. The Nick was still climbing. 37,000 FT. The Corsairs followed. The engines were screaming in protest. Metal was stressed beyond any test flight specifications. Chance Vought engineers had never once imagined their aircraft would operate at this altitude with this power setting for this duration. Nobody had designed for this extreme scenario. At 38,000 FT, 3,000 FT above the design limits, the two Corsairs finally closed within gun range of the Nick. The Japanese aircraft was 1 mile ahead. Rouser was fractionally faster. His Corsair reached the firing position first. He lined up directly behind the Nick's tail. The Japanese rear gunner saw him approaching. The Type 98 machine gun swiveled toward Rouser's Corsair. Rouser fired first. His remaining ammunition tore into the Nick's right engine. The engine cowling instantly shredded. Flames erupted. Thick black smoke poured from the damaged engine. The Nick slowed, but continued flying on its one engine. The rear gunner fired back. Tracers arced toward Rouser's aircraft. He broke left to evade the fire. His guns went completely empty. He had fired everything. Klingman moved into the perfect firing position. 50 FT behind the Nick's tail. His finger found the trigger. The rear gunner turned toward him. The Japanese machine gun fired. Bullets punched through Klingman's right wing. Fabric tore. Metal pinged sharply. He ignored the impacts. He pressed his trigger. Nothing. He pressed it again. Nothing. The guns were frozen solid. What happens when a pilot reaches his target after 90 minutes of climbing, only to discover his weapons will not fire? Could Klingman stop the Nick without working guns? At 38,000 FT, where the air was too thin to breathe and engines were operating beyond their physical limits, what desperate options remained? Klingman's mind calculated his options in seconds. To return to base meant the Nick would escape. The reconnaissance photographs would definitely reach Japanese commanders. Tomorrow's kamikaze wave would use that intelligence. American ships would burn. Sailors would die. The mission would be an abject failure. He could ram the Nick directly, fly his Corsair into the Japanese fuselage. Both aircraft would instantly go down. Both crews would die, but the mission would succeed. The reconnaissance data would sync with the Nick. It was a kamikaze solution, the Japanese way, not the American way. There had to be another, less suicidal option. The propeller, 4 blades, 13 FT4 in diameter. A Hamilton Standard Hydromatic. His was the 4-bladed model, spinning at 2,000 revolutions per minute, generating 40,000 lbs of thrust. When the blade tips broke the sound barrier, the propeller could indeed cut metal. He advanced his throttle and climbed above the nick. He told Rouser his plan over the radio. He would use the propeller as a weapon. He would strike the nick's tail section. The propeller blades would act as a circular saw, cutting through the aluminum. The tail would separate. The nick would lose control and crash. Both pilots knew the extreme risk. The propeller could shatter. The Corsair could easily go down with the nick. Rouser did not question the decision. He immediately moved his Corsair to the nick's flank. He would try to distract the rear gunner. Klingman positioned himself 200 FT above the nick. He nosed over into a shallow, accelerating dive. The Corsair accelerated slowly in the thin air. The nick grew larger in his windscreen. 150 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet. The Japanese rear gunner saw him coming. The machine gun swiveled violently upward. Muzzle flashes. Tracers arced toward the Corsair. Bullets struck the right wing. More fabric tore. Metal pinged against the airframe skin. Klingman held his dive angle perfectly steady. He aimed for the nick's vertical stabilizer, the tall tail fin, the rudder. The propeller would strike there first. 20 FU, 15 FFTU, 10 FFTU. The propeller disc now filled his entire view. 4 blades rotating at 2,000 RPM had become a circular saw 4 meters wide. The nick's tail section was centered in that deadly circle. Metal contacted metal at a closing speed of 50 knots. The sound was catastrophic, a grinding, shrieking, tearing sound. The propeller blades impacted the rudder and chewed immediately through the aluminum skin. Pieces of metal flew in all directions. Some struck the Corsair's windscreen. Spider cracks appeared in the glass. The nick shuddered violently from the force of the impact, but it kept flying. The rudder was damaged, but not completely destroyed. The tail section remained attached. Klingman had not hit hard enough. He pulled up and desperately climbed for a second attempt. His Corsair shook with dangerous violence. The propeller was clearly damaged. At least one blade was visibly bent. The severe imbalance created a dangerous vibration throughout the entire airframe. The control stick bucked and vibrated intensely in his hands. His instrument panel was blurred. He could barely read the vital gauges. The cylinder head temperature had climbed even higher. The engine was rapidly destroying itself. The nick's rear gunner tracked Rouser's Corsair. The Japanese gunner was firing at the easier target. Rouser broke right to evade. The gunner followed him. Klingman dove again. This time he aimed for the rear cockpit, the gunner's position. He would remove the defensive weapon before attempting his third attack. The dive angle was steeper. The damaged propeller screamed as it accelerated. The vibration worsened dangerously. Metal groaned throughout the airframe. Klingman fought the controls to maintain his aim point. The rear cockpit grew larger. The gunner spotted him at the very last second. Too late to fire. The Japanese soldier's face was briefly visible through the canopy glass. Young, perhaps 20 years old, terrified. The propeller struck the rear canopy with full crushing force. Glass exploded everywhere, metal shredded. The machine gun mount tore completely free from its base. The gun and the gunner were flung into the slipstream at 300 mph. Both disappeared into the thin air. The rear cockpit was gone, leaving only a ragged hole in the fuselage, but the nick still flew level on its remaining engine. Klingman pulled up for his third, final attack. 2 of his propeller blades were now bent almost back to the engine cowling. He could clearly see them through his windscreen, bent at 90-degree angles. The third blade was missing 6 inches from the tip, sheared off completely. The fourth blade was intact, but badly cracked. The vibration was now catastrophic. The engine was seconds from terminal failure. He climbed above the nick one final time. This attack had to work. His engine could not survive another impact. The propeller could not withstand any more damage. He had one chance. He positioned himself directly above the nick's tail section. He nosed over into a near vertical dive. Maximum speed. The damaged propeller howled loudly. The Nick's pilot attempted evasive maneuvers. Too late, too slow. The Corsair came straight down. The propeller struck the tail section at its absolute base. At the fuselage junction, where the tail attached to the main body, the weakest structural point, metal shrieked. Aluminum tore apart. The entire tail assembly separated completely. The Nick pitched forward instantly. No tail meant no control. The aircraft tumbled violently. Pieces broke away. The fuselage spun as it fell toward the Pacific 15,000 FT below. No parachutes appeared. The pilot and remaining crew went down with their reconnaissance data. The photographs would never reach Japanese commanders, but Klingman's Corsair entered its own violent spin. The third impact had utterly destroyed the propeller. The engine was failing. The airframe was stressed, beyond any safe limits. At 38,000 FT with a dead engine and a destroyed propeller, could he possibly survive the flight back home? The Corsair spun clockwise. Klingman's vision blurred. The horizon rotated violently. Sky, ocean, sky, ocean. The damaged propeller created a terrible asymmetric drag. The spin accelerated rapidly. Standard recovery procedures did not apply. The destroyed propeller was not creating normal forces. The airframe was damaged beyond any training scenario. He was forced to invent solutions in real time. He chopped the throttle to idle. The propeller stopped windmilling immediately. The asymmetric forces decreased. He applied full opposite rudder. The Corsair's spin slowed its rotation, but did not stop. He pushed the stick forward to gain critical airspeed. More speed meant more control authority. The Corsair's nose dropped toward the ocean. The spin continued, but much slower. At 36,000 FT, he regained partial control. The spin transitioned into a deep spiral, still descending, but less violent. He centered the rudder pedals. He pulled back gently on the stick. Too much input would stall the aircraft again. The Corsair's nose came up slowly. The spiral flattened out into a gentle descending turn. At 34,000 FT, he finally achieved level flight. The damaged propeller hung uselessly on the engine shaft. Two blades were bent completely backward. One blade was missing its tip. The fourth blade was cracked along its length. The entire assembly was unbalanced and useless. Starting the engine now would have torn it apart. He was committed to a single, dead-stick glide. 70 miles to Kadena. Starting altitude 34,000 FT glide ratio, approximately 12:1. The mathematics worked out, but barely. Furthermore, the fuel gauge read empty. Klingman had burned fuel at a maximum rate for 2 hours. The internal tanks were dry. He switched fuel selectors, checking each tank. Main, reserve, auxiliary, all were empty. The engine was cold, dead. Even if he wanted to restart it, there was no fuel. The propeller would never turn again. He was gliding a 10,000 Libby aircraft toward a runway 70 miles away. The oil pressure gauge showed 0. The engine had pumped its last oil during the combat. The seals had failed from the extreme heat and stress. Oil had leaked onto the hot metal, creating the black smoke he had seen. Without oil, even a cold engine could seize solid. The propeller shaft might lock, but it no longer mattered. The propeller was destroyed. The engine would never run again. Rouser formed up tightly on Klingman's wing. His Corsair was undamaged. His engine ran smoothly. He had plenty of fuel. He could have returned to base immediately to report the kill. Regulations required immediate confirmation of aerial victories. But Rouser stayed. He would not abandon his wingman. At 20,000 FT, Klingman calculated his glide path. He needed to reach Kadena with at least 1,000 FT of altitude, enough height to maneuver into the landing. Pattern: if he arrived too low, he would crash short of the runway. If he arrived too high, he could circle to lose altitude. But circling without power was extremely dangerous. One miscalculation meant death. The wind was from the east at 15 knots. It would push him west during the descent. He adjusted his heading to compensate for the drift. The wind would help him once he turned onto final approach. A headwind reduced ground speed during landing. That was helpful, but it also reduced his overall glide range. The calculations were complex. He estimated constantly. At 15,000 FT, he saw Okinawa. The island was brown and green. Kadena sat on the western coast. The runway was visible, a thin gray line against the darker terrain. 3,600 FT long, 150 FT wide, Plenty of room for a normal landing, not nearly enough room for a dead-stick emergency without power, especially with a destroyed propeller creating unpredictable drag. Rouser finally broke radio silence. He transmitted to Kadena Tower. Emergency inbound. 1 Corsair, no engine power, damaged propeller, request priority landing, clear the runway, position emergency equipment. The tower immediately acknowledged. Crash crews scrambled into action. Fire trucks rolled from their stations. Ambulances started engines. Medical personnel grabbed equipment. Everyone prepared for the worst possible outcome. At 10,000 FT, Klingman lowered his landing gear. The hydraulic system had residual pressure. 1 gear extension was perhaps possible. He pulled the gear handle. Nothing happened. He pulled it again. The nose gear dropped and locked. Green light. The right main gear dropped. Green light. The left main gear stuck halfway down. Red light. He recycled the gear handle up, then down. The left gear remained stubbornly stuck. He tried one more time, still stuck. The hydraulic pressure was simply too low for full extension. He was landing on 2 wheels and whatever the left gear could provide. The Corsair would pull hard left on touchdown. He would need full right rudder to keep it on the center line. If the left gear collapsed, the wing would hit first. The aircraft would cartwheel violently. Pilots rarely survived that. At 5,000 FT, his glide path looked good. He would reach the runway threshold with a margin of altitude, maybe 500 FT, enough to maneuver. But the stuck left gear changed everything. He needed a perfect approach angle, too steep, and the impact would collapse the gear instantly. Too shallow, and he would float long and run off the far end. The wind shifted now, coming from the northeast at 20 knots, stronger. The increased headwind reduced his glide range severely. His altitude advantage rapidly disappeared. He recalculated again. He would reach the threshold at 200 FT. His margin was gone. 1 updraft might save him. 1 downdraft would certainly kill him. At 2,000 FT, he was 3 miles from the runway. The approach angle was critical. He could see crash trucks positioned along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and dozens of personnel watching. Everyone knew what happened when aircraft landed with damaged gear. The Corsair could cartwheel at 100 knots. Metal, fuel, and ammunition would scatter across half a mile. At 1,000 FT, he was 1 mile out. The runway threshold was clearly visible. He aligned perfectly with the center line. The Corsair descended steadily. The air was smooth. No turbulence, no wind shear. Perfect conditions for gliding. But the stuck left gear remained red. 500 FT or half a mile. The threshold approached. He had 1 single chance. Would the left gear hold? The runway threshold passed beneath at 150 FT. Klingman held his glide at 85 knots. The Corsair descended toward the concrete. 100 FT or 75. 50. The damaged left gear showed red. It could collapse on impact. At 20 FT, he flared gently. The nose came up slightly. Airspeed bled off. The nose gear touched first. A gentle contact. The right main gear touched. Solid. The left main gear hit last. The red light stayed red, but the gear miraculously held. All 3 wheels were on the concrete. Klingman stood hard on the brakes. No engine thrust, no propeller drag, just friction. The Corsair slowed from 70 knots. The runway end approached. 2,800 FT remaining. 2,400. 2,000. He pumped the brakes even harder. The tires smoked against the concrete. 40 knots, 30, 20. Crash crews raced alongside. 1,000 FT remaining. 800, 600. The Corsair slowed to 15 knots, then 10. It stopped with 320 FT of runway remaining. Klingman shut down electrical systems. His hands were shaking violently. 2 hours of flying beyond every limit. He was alive. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft. They stared at the propeller. 2 blades bent back to the cowling, 6 inches missing from the third. The fourth cracked and twisted. Bullet holes riddled the wing. Thick oil covered the entire engine. The Corsair looked absolutely destroyed. The maintenance chief examined the damage, a master sergeant with 22 years in the Marines. He had seen damaged aircraft from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. He walked around the Corsair twice. He checked the engine, the propeller, the wing structure, the landing gear. His conclusion was immediate: total loss. The engine was destroyed. Bearings were seized, cylinders scored. 2 hours at maximum emergency power at impossible altitudes. Every component stressed beyond specifications. Rebuilding was impossible. The propeller was destroyed. All 4 blades damaged beyond repair. The hub was cracked. The airframe had stress damage throughout. The aircraft would never fly again. They would strip it for parts. Instruments, radios, anything undamaged would be salvaged. The rest would be scrapped. The Corsair that killed the Nick would cease to exist within days. But Klingman had accomplished his critical mission. 1 enemy reconnaissance aircraft destroyed. 1 set of kamikaze photographs prevented from reaching the enemy. Intelligence officers arrived within minutes. Navy. Regulations required pilot statements within 6 hours of combat. The information was time-sensitive. Other units needed to know the Nick's capabilities. Other pilots needed to know the propeller technique. Klingman described everything: the climb to 38,000 FT, the frozen guns, the 3 propeller attacks, the Nick's tail separating, no parachutes, the crew going down with their data. The officers asked specific questions. What altitude did guns freeze? 38,000 FT. Air temperature is 40 a berserk text F4U. Nick's maximum speed 220 knots. Defensive armament 1 Type 98 machine gun. Crew size confirmed 2. Pilot and gunner. They confirmed Rouser's witness statement matched Klingman's report perfectly. The kill was official. 1 Kawasaki Ki 45 Nick destroyed. No survivors. No reconnaissance data transmitted. Mission success. Klingman's 3rd confirmed kill, his first using a propeller as a weapon. The squadron commander recommended him for the Navy Cross, the 2nd highest military decoration. The citation would describe the frozen guns, the propeller attacks, the extreme altitude, the incredible risk, the prevention of reconnaissance data reaching the enemy, and the probable prevention of kamikaze strikes. But Klingman needed rest first. 2 hours and 20 minutes in the air. Stress far beyond normal combat. The flight surgeon examined him. Blood pressure elevated, heart rate elevated, mild dehydration, minor frostbite on his fingers from the extreme altitude cold. Nothing serious. He was cleared to fly again in 2 days. May 12th. Klingman flew another combat mission. Routine patrol, no contact. But his Corsair developed hydraulic failure. The landing gear would not extend. He bailed out at 5,000 FT over the ocean. A destroyer recovered him after 30 minutes in the water. He returned to Kadena, wet and cold, but uninjured. He flew the next day. The war continued. VMF 312 flew daily missions through June. Ground support, combat air patrol, intercepting kamikazes. Klingman accumulated more missions, more flight hours. By June 22nd, when Okinawa was finally declared secure, he had flown 78 combat missions. No more propeller attacks, but his May 10th mission became a legend. The Navy Cross arrived in July. The citation read that First Lieutenant Klingman had displayed extraordinary heroism and disregard for personal safety, that he had pursued an enemy aircraft beyond his own aircraft's limits, that he had improvised a weapon when his guns failed, that he had destroyed an enemy reconnaissance aircraft, preventing intelligence from reaching Japanese commanders, and that his actions potentially saved American lives. Other pilots studied his mission. The propeller ramming technique was thoroughly analyzed. Could it work again? Was it repeatable? The answer was, maybe, at extreme altitude, where guns froze, against slow reconnaissance aircraft, when the tactical situation absolutely demanded it. But it required precise, flawless, control, perfect timing, and the acceptance of fatally high risk. Few pilots would ever attempt it. Klingman had done it because he saw no other alternative. The war ended on August 15th. Japan surrendered. VMF 312 remained in Okinawa through September as occupation forces. Klingman flew his last combat mission on August 10th, 5 days before the surrender. A routine patrol, no enemy contact. The shooting war was over, but the May 10th mission had defined his service. At 38,000 FT with frozen guns, he had turned his aircraft into a weapon. Klingman returned to the United States in October 1945. He was 28 years old. He had survived 78 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills, 1 Navy Cross, 2 Air Medals, and 1 Distinguished Flying Cross. He had bailed out twice. He had landed without power once. He had used his propeller as a weapon once. Most pilots never experienced one of those events. Klingman experienced all of them in 6 short months. He married his girlfriend in San Diego. She was Jackie Cochran, not the famous aviator, but a different woman with the same name. She had waited for him through the entire war. He kept his parachute from the May 12th bailout. She famously turned it into her wedding dress, white silk parachute material, a permanent reminder that he had survived. Klingman stayed in the Marines. The Corps needed experienced, seasoned pilots for the post-war force. He transitioned to different aircraft. He taught younger pilots. He shared the critical lessons from Okinawa, the importance of altitude, the danger of frozen guns, the value of improvisation when standard weapons failed. Future generations learned from his insane, life-saving experience. Korea erupted in June 1950. Communist forces invaded South Korea. The United Nations responded with military intervention. American forces deployed within weeks. The Marines immediately sent units. Klingman deployed as a forward air controller, FAC, with the 1st Marine Division. He coordinated crucial close air support for ground troops. A different role, the same war. The air war over Korea was structurally different from the Pacific conflict. Jet aircraft had replaced propeller fighters. MiG-15s challenged American air superiority, but the core mission remained unchanged. Close air support for Marines on the ground. Klingman directed strikes against enemy positions. He marked targets with smoke. He talked pilots onto coordinates. He saved Marine lives daily through accurate air support. He served in Korea for 13 months. Forward air controller was dangerous work, close to the front lines, exposed to enemy fire, directing strikes within meters of friendly positions. One mistake meant American casualties. Klingman made no mistakes. The Marines he supported survived. He received another Air Medal for his Korea service. He returned to the United States in 1952. He continued serving through the 1950s and early 1960s. He trained more pilots. He passed on more essential lessons. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. 32 years of service, 1934 to 1966, from an enlisted drummer to a field-grade officer, from the Great Depression to the Cold War. His career spanned American military history. Retirement came in 1966. He was 49 years old. He moved to Hawaii with his wife. They settled in Kihei, Maui. He earned his private pilot license. Despite everything that had happened during the war, he still absolutely loved flying. He flew small civilian aircraft around the Hawaiian Islands. He never lost his passion for flight. He rarely spoke about May 10th, 1945. His family knew the basic story: propeller attack at high altitude, Navy Cross, but he did not elaborate. He did not seek any attention for his heroism. Most combat veterans were the same. They had done what the mission required, nothing more. They simply moved forward with their lives. The story became widely known through military historians, through squadron records, through Rouser's witness statements, and through the Navy Cross citations. The astonishing details emerged slowly over decades. Other pilots learned about it. Aviation enthusiasts studied the mission. Military analysts examined it. The propeller ramming technique became a dark, incredible part of naval aviation history. Robert Klingman died on July 6, 2004, in Kihei, Hawaii. He was 87 years old. Complications from a stroke. His wife survived him. His children survived him. His grandchildren survived him. He left behind a towering legacy that extended far beyond one single mission. 32 years of honorable service. Hundreds of lives saved through his air support work. Countless pilots trained. A lifetime of dedication. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, with full military honors. A flag-draped coffin, Marine Honor Guard, rifle salute, and taps. The ceremony recognized his entire service, not just May 10th, 1945. Everything he did. His grave marker lists his decorations: Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Gold Star. Just the facts, the Marine Corps way. But the May 10th mission stands utterly alone in aviation history. No other pilot deliberately used a propeller as a precision weapon at extreme altitude and lived to tell the tale. Others rammed enemy aircraft, but those were full aircraft collisions, suicide attacks, desperate measures. Klingman used his propeller as a precision instrument of destruction, 3 calculated strikes. He survived, he flew home, he landed safely. He lived another 59 years. The mission proved several immutable things. American pilots would push beyond any limit to complete vital objectives. Aircraft could operate beyond design specifications when absolutely required. Improvisation worked perfectly when standard tactics had failed. One single determined pilot could prevent reconnaissance that would cost American lives. The NIC never transmitted its photographs. The kamikaze coordinators never received that intelligence. American ships survived another crucial day. Do you have a personal connection to the World War II history? Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from, and if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Let the world know they mattered.